we have our speakers ready to go. We'll start off with Thomas Reinhardt, A4E's Managing Director. He will be followed by Dr. Christian Panet from EASA's Medical Department, who I'm especially pleased could join us today on his day off. Thank you, Christian. Followed by Olivier Jankovic, the Director General of ACI Europe. Thank you, Olivier, for joining us. I know you're very, very busy, also on the airport side. I'm glad you could make it. And then, of course, all the way from Seattle, Jim Haas from Boeing's team, from Boeing Commercial. Jim is heavily involved, obviously, in the Confident Traveler program and the restart. So again, special thanks also to you, Jim, for joining us so early in Seattle. I would just like to, well, we've already seen we have some technical trouble. I hopefully we got it out of the way now. So we'll proceed as is. If everyone can just mute themselves, and if you have a question for any of our speakers, please send it to me via the chat, and I will introduce your question. Before you speak, just unmute yourself, state your name, and of course, the outlet that you work for before asking your question. That is it from my side. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Thomas Reinhardt from A4E.
Thank you, Jennifer. I hope that you're all right. Starting next week, as of the 15th of June, many of the A4E airlines will be restarting their operations, flight schedules, basically in line with the reopening of the EU borders. Not all of the EU borders, as many of us know, of course, but it's certainly, I think, a good milestone that many of our airline members have been planning for, and frankly, since the day that they were forced to ground their fleets. And as I might add, they have been planning reopening amid the most dire circumstances in terms of loss of liquidity, employment uncertainty, and operational turmoil. This week, the IATA projected 2020 will go down as the worst year in airlines' financial history,
which is pretty striking, with expected losses totaling about
74 billion euros, assuming all goes well, or according to plan. And
2021 is forecasted to be an equally challenging year, with about 14 billion euros in net losses as currently projected. And this against the backdrop of aviation's role
as a driver for the European economy. As a reminder, following points: aviation represents more than 10 million jobs and some 800 billion euros in European economic activity. Secondly, that's about 3.3% of all employment and about 4% of all GDP in European countries. And that's exactly also why today this briefing is so important, which we wanted to organize, and we want to help kickstart. Europe's economic recovery from this crisis is important, and to ensure that travelers feel ultra confident again that it's safe to go out and fly again. Or as one pilot, I think, bluntly put it some time ago in the social media, people should go out and buy plane tickets now like they did buy toilet paper. In all seriousness, this is why we've gathered this group again here today to share a bit of the expert work and medical research that has been done and that has led us to say that as a sector, we're ready to welcome the passengers again. And together with the other aviation associations, A4E has worked very closely with all of the relevant authorities to restart. We've provided as A4E key input for our airline and manufacturing members when it comes to specific preventive measures, which you'll hear about shortly, including, for instance, the need for passengers to wear face masks throughout the journey. Also the role of the famous HEPA filters in providing clean air aboard. Also specific roles and responsibilities when it comes to putting these guidelines and preventive measures into practice at a national level, which is, of course, very important at the end of the day. Our air transport system has never been stopped so abruptly before, but now it is time to restart. The speed at which recovery can happen will depend, of course, largely on the execution of by the member states. And I'm thrilled that Dr. Christian Panet from EASA's medical department could join us today, as Jennifer mentioned earlier, on his day off even. So Christian, thanks very much. And I'm curious to know if you've traveled anywhere by chance lately. Dr. Panet is the lead author of EASA's medical, who penned the recent EASA ECDC guidelines, which were published, as you know. So we're extremely lucky to have him with us today to walk through some of the health measures that are necessary from a scientific perspective and which will be in place as part of the restart. Before I turn things over to Christian, let me reiterate that we as A4E, we're confident that people really not only are willing to fly, but really want to fly again as soon as possible. And when they do, our airlines will be ready to welcome them in the safest way they know now. By that I mean air travel was the safest means of transport before COVID-19, and it remains the safest transport during and post-COVID-19. And everyone has a role to play, of course, and responsibilities to take. And if we stick to the rules, if passengers wear their masks, if they fill out their passenger locator cards, if member states, very importantly, ensure the appropriate health procedures, resources are put in place at the airports, then I think European aviation has a chance of recovering more quickly from this crisis as we may have hoped for, and that passengers can look forward to the connectivity and the service they all deserve after this long break. So with that, I pass over back to Jennifer. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, with that, thanks, Thomas. With that, we had one question for you, Thomas, from Martin. He was asking about losses for EU airlines in 2021, how bad the losses will be for next year. So we expect some sort of recovery to start to for next year, but will it be as bad, or what are the current projections?
Thank you very much for the question. If I just quickly may, I mean, the recovery, of course, apart from all the work that we are doing, airports and airlines and all the relevant parties for making sure that people can fly, the recovery also depends on the recovery of the economy. And that is very difficult to predict with the more exact figures I already gave you just now. So we'll need to see, because it will depend not only on passenger confidence, but also on general consumer confidence and business confidence. So all these indices and actually the real recovery of the economy, but also globally, that will also be a determining factor in the recovery of our sector.
Okay, great. Thanks, Thomas. Again, if you have questions, send them to me via the chat. If we can manage them right after the individual speakers, otherwise we will have a Q&A session at the very end for all our speakers. I'd like to now turn things over to Christian from EASA. Christian, if you're with us still, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Thomas, for the introduction. I hope you can hear me well. First of all, before starting my presentation, I will pick a bit on what Thomas said earlier, that we are actually all in this together, and it's a shared responsibility for all parties involved, authorities, airlines, airports, all the services around this, as well as the passengers. Yeah, thank you for mentioning several times that here in Germany, where EASA is located today, is bank holiday, but actually for the past 3 months, since we are in a crisis mode, we don't have any holidays, any weekends, so we are working around the clock. Now to officially start the presentation, as mentioned by Jennifer and by Thomas, my name is Christian Panet. I'm a medical expert within EASA, working together with our ops experts, aerodrome experts, as well as with our colleagues from ECDC on the epidemiology side, to prepare aviation for safe return to operations. To give you a bit of background, on the 13th of May, the European Commission's guidelines were issued, providing some high-level principles for the safe return to operation, and at the same time mandating EASA and ECDC to develop detailed operational guidelines in order to facilitate a coordinated approach and to assist the aviation stakeholders with reduced operations, the ones that had reduced operations, because cargo and humanitarian flights still continued to take place. But the ones that were affected to be able to restart their operations without endangering the health and safety of the passengers, of their staff and crew members. The operational guidelines are basically including the safety management principles that are very well known and implemented throughout the aviation system, and set out to be a basic aviation health safety protocol, hence the name of the document, for the operators and the airports within EU, but also to be used by the operators flying to and from EU member states. The protocol is designed to cover the full travel experience already before leaving towards the airport, throughout the check-in procedure, baggage drop, boarding, the actual flight, up to the moment where the passengers leave the terminal building of the destination airport. It includes measures and recommendations which are based on scientific evidence, as well as expert opinion from both European agencies, in line with the principles of the International Health Regulation of 2005, which is implemented among the European member states. The chain of these mitigating reactions we consider is as strong as its weakest link. And for this reason, as Thomas mentioned and I highlighted at the beginning, EASA and ECDC are actually asking everyone involved to take responsibility to implement the recommendation, to adhere to them, and put everything that is applicable for their role in place in order to provide to everyone a safe and comfortable travel experience. Now to go a bit more towards the actual measures that were recommended. According to the scientific evidence, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the virus which is causing this COVID-19 disease, is mainly transmitted via droplets discharged by infected people when they cough or they sneeze or simply exhale. In a much smaller proportion, the virus can also be transmitted by inhaling smaller floating droplets which are lingering in the air, or by touching contaminated surfaces and then touching the mouth, nose, or even the eye. But as mentioned, this part is less of a challenge. Nevertheless, the protocol includes measures to mitigate all the possible ways of transmission, to reduce the risk to bare minimum achievable, and to ensure that the passengers have a safe journey. The personal hygiene measures, coughing etiquettes, the famous coughing in the elbow measure, wherever possible distancing, and face masks, the wearing of medical face masks, are all intended to reduce the direct transmission via droplets from the infected persons. In particular, and we made this clear in the guidelines, Also, coughing etiquette still stays available even if the passenger or the person is wearing a mask. This still needs to be done. Additional personal protective equipment and protection screens, depending on the interaction of the staff member or crew members with the passengers and the tasks that they need to perform, are also recommended to reduce the risk of transmission of the virus both ways, from the passenger to the staff and vice versa. Also, to reduce the risk of contamination from inanimate surfaces, we recommended enhanced cleaning and disinfection for both airport facilities and onboard aircraft, and also enhanced ventilation to reduce, again, the risk of inhaling floating droplets. In addition to this, we have also included recommendations for the airlines and airports to develop procedures for the management of passengers that are not willing to adhere to the recommendations. For example, they would not like to wear a mask, or they get too close to the passengers near them, and so on. Before arriving at the airport, the passenger and the airlines are nowadays in contact in the vast majority of cases. And we recommend the airlines to provide appropriate information to the passenger in regards to the preventive measures which are in place in the airport and for the boarding procedure, and the time that would be required to go through these procedures, and to allow them to have enough time for boarding, baggage drop-off, but without unduly extending the time spent in the airport, not to create additional risks. The airlines and the airport operators, in coordination, are encouraged to create as much as possible a non-touch experience with online check-in, with non-touch boarding. Wherever possible, this should be implemented to reduce the concentration of passengers, such as queuing for the check-in or queuing for the luggage drop-off. Of course, this is not possible in 100% of the times, but as much as possible, this has to be avoided, especially at the beginning when the risk would be a bit higher and the number of passengers is a bit lower, allowing for such implementation. During their check-in procedure, the passengers are expected to acknowledge that they take full responsibility and do not present themselves for the flight if they present symptoms that are relevant for COVID-19, or if they have been in contact with a suspected or confirmed case of COVID-19 patients in the recent days before the flight. Knowing that the medical face masks are effective for up to 4 hours, and they would be required to be changed every 4 hours, or whenever they become wet or soiled, the passengers should take this into consideration. The airlines would provide information to them in this regard, and they should, the passengers should have an appropriate amount of masks to ensure efficient protection for them and for their fellow passengers throughout the entire travel experience. At the airport, as the risk derives actually not from the airport facilities, but from the people populating a certain area, so from the human interaction, a higher concentration of people actually increases the risk of transmission. For this reason, we recommend for the airport operators and for the airlines to work together and to inform the passengers within this package of information which is provided to them before the flight, to inform them that accompanying persons are not allowed in the terminal building unless there are some exceptional circumstances, such as accompanying passengers with reduced mobility or unattended minors. Furthermore, the airport operator should implement information in visual and audio format regarding the point beyond which the accompanying persons should not be allowed. We do not expect a particular checkpoint to verify this. That would create queuing, and we base our trust that the passengers would take responsibility and do what is right to decrease the risk for everyone involved. The airlines should inform their passengers in advance and also put in place incentives to minimize the carry-on luggage in order to facilitate easy boarding and disembarking procedures, and also to reduce the movement on board the aircraft, which is, as we all know from our own travel experience, can be quite high, going and checking something, taking something from the luggage, taking it back, and so on and so forth. Another measure at the airport level would be for the boarding procedures. Everything should be done in an orderly manner to avoid queuing and close contact. Depending on the facilities of the airport and the aircraft type, this can be done in several models by rows, starting with the furthest from the entrance to the aircraft, or by putting first window, middle, and aisle seats, and so on, as said, depending on the aircraft type and airport facilities. Physical distancing of 1.5 meter should be implemented throughout the airport, and passengers should be regularly informed to respect that distance. Wherever possible, this is the ideal distance to have. The ventilation also at the airport level should be enhanced to reduce the air circulation and increase the amount of fresh air. Particular attention should be paid to avoiding horizontal airflows, which may re-aerosolize contaminated droplets which are already set on surfaces. Thermal screening is an additional measure to identify symptomatic passengers and consequently reduce the risk of having contagious passengers in the airport and on board the aircraft. On board the aircraft, the use of masks and reduced interaction among the passengers and also between the passengers and crew members are intended to reduce the risk of direct contamination. The safety demonstration, because we don't want to deviate from the safety standards in any way by putting these measures in place. The safety demonstrations should include aspects that are related to the medical face masks, which should be removed in the unlikely event of a decompression or whenever there is an emergency situation. This needs to be further detailed to the passengers so they know how to react. Furthermore, the cabin crew, in unlikely case of having an emergency, they should remove their masks when providing instructions to the passengers. That would facilitate the communication, not only verbal, but also the non-verbal communication, which is very important. Further details regarding the onboard emergencies, as well as the management of the suspected passengers potentially identified during flight, are provided for implementation by the airlines. Additional protections are provided by the seating position and the seat design, which further reduce the risk of viral spread. And of course, a subject that will be touched later on by a future speaker, the air quality and the ventilation are enhanced, and with an increased exchange rate of exchange of air in the cabin, and with the HEPA filters that are used, this would reduce to the minimum the potential contamination from floating droplets. For disembarking, the measure should be rather similar to the boarding, should be somehow in the mirror towards the boarding procedure, with additional focus on cleaning and disinfecting of facilities in the arrival hall, looking here with particular focus on the lavatories, and also reinforcing the personal hygiene for passengers via video and audio information. If required by the state of arrival, thermal screening can also be enforced. This is up to the state to decide if they require for the arriving passengers. Baggage claims should be also enhanced in order to avoid close human contact, and also passengers should be informed and encouraged to exit the airport as soon as all the procedures have been completed. In order to provide support for implementation of the protocol and recommendations for the passengers, EASA has developed health safety promotion materials in a communication campaign to include the essential points and provide clear guidance needed for all stages of the journey. Such materials are already available on EASA website. And with this, I complete my very summary presentation. I look forward to your questions. I hope you managed to hear me loud and clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian, for that great information. We did have a couple questions during your presentation. I know there's an echo. Just give me 1 second. There was some questions from Utenta. Utenta, please, could you go ahead and ask your questions? Just unmute yourself, please, and okay, Utenta, I will ask you questions for you. So Utenta had a question, Christian, regarding whether it's necessary to wear gloves or not whilst you travel. Also, are you allowed to cough? And is physical distancing on board the plane necessary? Those were the 3 questions.
Let's start with the easy one. Are you allowed to cough? That is impossible to forbid. Coughing is a physiological act. You cannot prevent anyone to. Oops. Let's give it another try. Okay, so you cannot prohibit anyone from coughing. That's clear, yeah. But we can emphasize the need of coughing etiquette. So even if they have the masks on, they still need to cough into their elbow or into a napkin that they dispose of immediately. Regarding the other questions, if you could repeat some of them to me, that would be great.
If gloves.
Okay, yeah. Okay, the gloves. The gloves are actually not recommended, neither for the passengers, not for the crew, except for when the crew interacts with the passengers very, very often, and they are not able to wash their hands between each interaction. But basically, the main recommendation is to wash their hands because it's not medical conditions such as, and I'm giving you here just an example, such as Ebola, which is transmitted through the skin. Here, if you put the gloves, you will transmit the virus to other surfaces just as well as you do by hand. And many of us still touch their face with the gloves just as well as without them. So it doesn't give any additional protection whatsoever to the passengers and to the crew. The main recommendation here is to wash their hands as often as possible and to avoid touching surfaces they don't need to do so.
Okay, I think in the interest of time, we'll move on to the next speaker. We have other questions that have come in the chat, and we'll get to your questions at the very end. So thank you again, Christian, for your responses. I'd like to now ask Olivier if he'll take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Yes, good afternoon. Can you hear me well? Yes, good. Well, I'd like first to thank Thomas and A4E for inviting the airports, ACI Europe, to be part of this briefing. As has been said already, we're all in this together. So I think it's very important that, in a way, that briefing also reflects a lot of the work we've done cooperatively between airports and airlines, but also with EASA. First, I would like really to largely echo the introductory comments from Thomas, but from the perspective of airports. I think at the moment, clearly, we see airports having been brought down on their knees by the COVID-19. As of 31st of May, we had lost 530 million passengers. And if we look at the last 2 months, April and May, there was virtually no traffic at all at airports. I mean, the level of traffic was just 2% of the normal traffic. If I quote the CEO of Zurich Airport, with whom I had regular exchanges, one day when I called him in May, he told me, well, today basically we have the same traffic that we had on that same day in 1949. So that gives you a bit really the extent to which all things have come to a standstill. At the same time, most airports have remained open to support critical supplies, sanitary flights, but also to ensure the repatriation of European citizens. But still, with no traffic and no revenue, but still significant fixed costs to bear, the financial impact, as you can imagine, has been equally devastating for airports as it has been for airlines. I think clearly this is a crisis that is impacted the entire air transport ecosystem. For the full year 2020, we anticipate that Europe's airports will be losing 1.3 billion passengers. That means a reduction of 57%. And with this will come a reduction in revenues of 32 billion euro. That's a reduction of 61%. So needless to say, we're very eager to see airlines progressively restarting their flight schedules as of next week. And a lot of work has been done to prepare for that in full cooperation, of course, between airports and airlines and the competent authorities, both at European and national level. As Christian has said, there's not been really quiet moments for us in the past 3 months. I'd like to say that the EASA ECDC guidance have been essential for us to allow for the restart. From the beginning, ACI Europe and airports were really fully supportive of EASA taking the lead and coming up with a European standard that would facilitate a coordinated restart based on a common health safety protocol. I think such a common health safety protocol is an absolute prerequisite, in particular if we want to ensure the confidence of the traveling public, but also, and I think that's very important, the confidence of our staff. So we've been working very closely together with the EASA over the past weeks, and I'd like to thank EASA for having associated us very closely to their work. Since the guidance of EASA was released on the 20th of May, airports across Europe have been really following and implementing the measures recommended by EASA and the ECDC. Many airports have accepted to participate in pilots with EASA to be able to give to EASA a return on experience so that the rules can be fine-tuned wherever they need to be fine-tuned to reflect also the real-life operations. And I think airports have already started that actually without even waiting for their national authorities to endorse the guidance and come up with their own implementing measures. I think it's important to stress that generally aviation, in our view, is better positioned than other sectors when dealing with this kind of situation. First, because we do have a very strong safety-driven and focused corporate culture. As you know, we're very regulated when it comes to safety. And also because basically the level of regulatory control and oversight on aviation, be it airport or airlines, has always been very significant. So working with regulators, with body of EASA is something we do on a daily basis. And I think when you look in particular at hygiene and cleaning, I think it's also fair to recognize that airports are among the cleanest and most hygienic mass transportation infrastructure and public spaces in Europe. And I think that is also a reflection of years of continued investment in the modernization and upgrading our facilities. With the additional measures that airports are now putting in place, and I won't repeat Christian's words there, I think he has described the thrust of those measures. I think we can consider that airports will be among the safest places on the ground from a hygiene and health point of view, and that we can say that when it comes to the risk of COVID-19 transmission, it will be no doubt safer for people to go to their local airports than to go to their local supermarkets. So airports now are putting a lot of efforts in communication at the moment. It's about educating passengers about these new measures, informing them, and I think this is something we need to do very closely, and we're doing very closely with the airlines. But it's also, I think, very important that we communicate to passengers that minimizing transmission risk is actually a common and collective responsibility. So of course we have to play our part as airports and airlines to guarantee the best environment and the safest environment possible. But with COVID-19, it is about also the individual responsibility of each and single passenger. And I think there we're facing a bit a new reality where we will need passengers to also adhere to what we can call a new traveling etiquette. And I think this is something, of course, that will take time to come into the generic behavior of people. But this is where we're going to have to work a lot in terms of communication, of course, as soon as we see passengers coming through our doors and as soon as we'll be able to welcome them. So that's it for me. I'm ready for questions after the next speaker or before. Thank you very much.
Okay. So much, Olivier, for that. Very, very useful indeed. I'd like to move on to our last speaker before we move into a Q&A session. So Jim Haas, an engineer by trade, and as far as I know, one of the developers of the 787 for Boeing. If you'd like to now take the floor, we'd welcome your comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good afternoon, everyone. What I'd like to do is talk about Boeing's approach to this pandemic. And we, as you have heard echoed by other speakers, we're approaching this in a multi-layered approach. The first layer is really helping the passengers make sure they can not travel when they're ill, work with airports to have proper screening and protective measures in place. And that is the first layer. And our goal is trying to prevent best we can the virus from getting on the airplane. The second layer of protection is the airplane itself. Before the passengers board, we have given airlines guidance on how not only to clean the airplane, but how to disinfect the airplane. So when the passengers board, that airplane has been disinfected. The third layer is when the passengers are actually on board the airplane. It's important to understand how the air circulates in the airplane. The first thing people need to understand is that the air coming into the airplane is clean. It's a mixture of fresh outside air and air that has been circulated but gone through a HEPA filter. And those HEPA filters, which you've heard about from other speakers, are highly effective. These are similar to the same type of filters that are used in hospital operating rooms and isolation wards. They pull out 99.9% of viruses and bacteria and fungi that circulate. So the air coming in is clean. The air also circulates from top to bottom. It does not go front to back in the airplane. It comes in at the top, goes downward vertically, and then out at the floor level near the passenger's feet in the same area that it came in. We designed our air systems this way to mitigate and minimize any possibility of air going forward and backward. We also exchange the air in the cabin very, very rapidly. Every 2 to 3, the air in the cabin is totally exchanged. So any contaminants in the cabin would be quickly removed. And lastly, you heard about personal responsibility. This is also an important part of the protection because the HEPA filters I described are very, very effective at pulling out viruses and bacteria. What we want to make sure is that passengers do wear masks or face coverings to protect against that cough. And that will help mitigate any chance of virus propagation. There was a very interesting report put out by IATA just about a month ago that actually did a limited set of contact tracing, and they went through, I think they surveyed 18 major airlines, and they found that the probability of virus transmission in flight was very low. And this was before a lot of the protective measures were in place. This was earlier this year. Because I know there are questions coming up of, is it, why are we not blocking middle seats? And Boeing does not advocate for blocking middle seats. And the reason why is when you think about protective measures in place to protect people from virus transmission, one of the common procedures people are familiar with is physical distancing. However, there are other common procedures in place in areas where physical distancing is not practical or not possible. And we have those measures in place on our airplanes. Those measures are the air circulation we've designed in, the HEPA filters, the rapidity at which the air is exchanged. All of those things, in addition to the seating layouts, where the passengers all sit in seats, they're facing forward, and there are relatively high back seats separating the passengers. All of these things, we think, provide a very safe environment. And it's this layered approach that gives us confidence that traveling by air will be the safest way to travel in the future. So with that, Jennifer, let me turn it back over to you for questions.
Thank you very, very much, Jim. Just bear with me 1 second. We are going to turn it over to some questions that I've received. We'll start with Saeem. I believe, Saeem, you had a question, Saeem, from Politico regarding temperature checks at the airport. So Saeem, if you want to ask your question and to whom it's addressed.
Sure. My question is addressed to the EASA representative to talk about temperature checks and the report, the guidelines by the ECDC and EASA said that they are a low efficiency, high cost measure. So I'm just wondering why there's been such a push to adopt them at so many different airports, including Heathrow, for example.
Thank you, Saeem, for the question. It may be low efficiency and for sure it involves a lot of resources. Nevertheless, it still has some efficiency, and we have the experience from our colleagues from Asia, which detected a lot of passengers symptomatic during this pandemic. This will be, as Jim put it, one of the layers in the multi-layer approach. As we have a certain high level of safety, including the health safety, this is what we need right now, to put smaller measures to give, even if it is a small added value, but it is an added value. Of course, it's up to the governments and to the national authorities to decide how they implement this, because of this high resources required, not necessarily in terms of costs, but in terms of people assessing positive cases. Nevertheless, as I said, this has a direct effect of detecting symptomatic passengers. And we know that in lower temperature, so in a fever, but with a moderate temperature, the person may not be aware, if they don't have any other symptoms, that they are actually symptomatic. So this is an additional filter to giving them full responsibility to self-declare. And also, this has a deterrent effect on the ones that are symptomatic. They know that they are symptomatic, but they would take the risk anyway to come to the airport. So it has a double effect. It is not a measure that we can discard easily, although it is with maybe a lower efficiency than others. Nevertheless, as Jim also put it, there are measures that can work together in the multi-layered approach. And unfortunately, I have to say, we do not have any perfect measure that will work just by itself in protecting everyone, as we have different transmission pathways and so on. I hope this answers your question. Thank you.
Saim, if I may comment also from the export perspective on this. This is something some of our members, especially the larger hubs, have been quite keen on, because they consider it is a measure that can help reassure passengers, especially passengers coming from Asia, given that in Asia, thermal screening is really widespread. So many airports like Heathrow, but also Aéroport de Paris, feel that because a large chunk of their passengers are coming from Asia, they feel it is important to do this also from assurances perspective vis-a-vis those passengers.
Okay, thanks, Olivier. We did have a question from Eric from Le Soir, and the question was, I think, for Jim, regarding whether the most modern aircraft today have HEPA filters on board, or what kind of aircraft typically carry the HEPA filters on board.
Good question. All production airplanes have these new HEPA filters. In fact, these very efficient HEPA filters I described have actually been installed on airplanes for approximately the last 25 years. So even though these are extremely effective filters, they are not brand new. They've been in place for a long time. And even the very oldest airplanes that are out there have the ability to put on these new HEPA filters, because HEPA filters get changed at regular intervals per the airplane's maintenance manual. So even if an airplane is quite old and was originally delivered with an older style filter, it has gone through many filter changes and most likely has the newest type of filters.
Wow, thank you, Jim, for that. I didn't know it was that extensive, but very good for us all to know. There's another question from, it just shows a PC, and the question is for Olivier. I presume many ACI airports still have a very fragmented practice when it comes to following EASA ICAO medical guidelines. When will that change to give the passengers a more trustworthy picture? Olivier, if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, I think the key issue that airports have to follow is, of course, what their competent national authorities is telling them to do. So, as I said, many airports are trying to anticipate as much as possible that by actually looking into how to implement what EASA and ECDC has been recommending from the moment those rules were published. But ultimately, what we need is the legal certainty of what is being recommended by each national authorities. Now, it's clear that the EASA guidance is a guidance that in scope aims to be pan-European or even potentially international. I think Christian stressed that aspect. And as ACI, representing the airport industry, we've been really urging all states in Europe, and we've been actually writing to all states in Europe together with IATA to urge, to tell them to follow the EASA guidance and try not to depart from it, because indeed, you know, if everybody does the same thing, then it means that the passenger confidence is better to get. Now, we of course don't control national authorities, and we cannot exclude that some national authorities might want to depart or possibly add some things to the EASA guidance, but that's not within our hands. And that is why ultimately you might see some slight divergences between what is being done at airports. But I think broadly the feedback we have across our 500 plus members is that they're mostly following in broad terms I mean, what their national authorities are asking them is to follow in broad terms the EASA guidance. I mean, there might be some variances at the margins, but I think generally everybody agrees that what EASA is recommending is what needs to be followed.
Thank you very much, Olivier. We're running short on time. I have time for maybe one or two more questions. This is a question from earlier from Max. Max asks, we've been informed that on trains, the capacity is cut to 50%, but we know that nothing changes if a flight is full. There's no distance. Is that the case? Is that correct, or am I mistaken? So this is a question about social distancing measures on trains versus on board. I don't know if maybe Christian, if you might have a go at.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Max. I think there was a similar one also on the chat on the same topic. So hopefully the answer will provide a proper answer to both of them. I think Jim already mentioned something about this. Of course, where possible, distancing is recommended. Where this is not possible, because not only of the capacity of the passenger load, because this is the list that we are looking at, but we have different type of aircraft. We have aircraft that have 2 seats on one side and 1 seat on the other side, or 2 and 2, or 3 and 2, and so on. Different conformations, different types of aircraft. Also, we have very strict requirements for mass and balance in the aircraft. So we cannot deviate too much from that in order not to endanger flight safety. And in addition to this that we need to take into consideration, we consider also, as Jim mentioned, all the other preventive measures that are in place, in particular in the aircraft, like the air circulation and the rate of air exchange on board, the HEPA filters, and also the mobility of the passenger, which is a very important factor. A train stops at every train station. People are getting down, people are getting up. They manage their luggage throughout the train. They move to the a lot for various reasons, and this happens a lot less in the aircraft. And as mentioned, we have put in place also recommendation to further limit the movements in the cabin, to have less luggage on board, minimize the service on board to the bare minimum that is required for the well-being of the passengers, in order especially not to change this airflow, which has a particular pattern and which is protective, and also not to have people going up and down the aisle, breathing or coughing towards the other passengers. I think all of this together give more protection than just saying, yes, we put it by half or by 2/3 or by whatever norm, but not considering anything else outside of that. I hope that covers. Thank you.
I would just like to reiterate that what you just said, Christian, with regards to other modes of transport. I mean, would you say that compared to other modes of transport, in fact, given this combination of measures in the controlled environment of the airport and on board, that it's probably, one could argue, safest to travel by plane compared to other modes of transport? Would you agree with that?
Of course. This is by far the safest means of public transport. You cannot have a similar level of safety in any train, bus, taxi, or whatever other means of public transport, because of this multi-layered protective measures that are put in place in order to give the best, then the safest experience from health and also from flight safety perspective to our passengers.
Great. One last question for Olivier. Thank you, Christian. Some airports in Europe ask passengers to do COVID tests, ask passengers to take a test for free. Is this a measure that ACI is recommending, Olivier?
Well, I think, thank you, Jen. I think I need to clarify that no airport in Europe is asking that by itself. When there is a need for tests to be taken, this is a requirement from the competent health national authorities, certainly not from the airport. So as airports, we just comply and do whatever the health authorities tell us to do. I think there is a few airports who are been offering the possibility for passengers to take tests. And that was linked to the fact that travel restrictions imposed by certain countries were requiring tests for passengers coming from other countries. And I think that's what led to Vienna Airport to get a laboratory settling down at the airport and offer the possibility for passengers to do the test so that as to avoid or reduce the duration of the quarantine. But no airport itself is asking passengers to do tests.
Okay, great.
Jennifer, if I may intervene on the same topic, we consider this in the discussions with the ECDC, and this is reflected in the annex to our protocol, to the joint protocol. Currently available tests, the rapid ones, have a low specificity and low sensitivity. So we may have a lot of false negative, false positive cases. The most reliable one is based on the PCR, the polymerase chain reaction, but those require a bit more time to give you the proper result. Nevertheless, even with those requiring a bit more time, they illustrate the situation of the passenger at the moment of the sample collection. In several hours, the situation can change and the passenger can become contagious. And because of all this unreliability of the current tests, this was not considered to be added as a preventive measure. Also, it's not a very pleasant experience to have, it's quite an invasive test. So this was the reason for not putting it in as a recommendation. We discussed with ECDC and we are monitoring the scientific evolution. And in case a reliable test becomes available and could be used, this will be added in a future update of the guideline without any problem.
Very good. Thank you so much, Christian. If there are no other questions, I think we're over time. Apologize again for the technical difficulties at the start, but I think we've made it through and hopefully we've learned a few things. I'd like to thank all of our speakers once again for sharing their thoughts. And if you have any other follow-up questions for us, please feel free to be in touch. We will, of course, share the slides with you from today and be available in case going forward over the next few months. Undoubtedly, we'll be in touch with you again. So thanks again and have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.